So I wanted to welcome you all to this event. I'm really excited that you're able to join us today for our first program of the academic year, Becoming a Home for All, LGBTQ Tourism in 1960s West Michigan. My name is Nora Salas, and I'm the new director of the Cucci Office of Local History. The Cucci Office of Local History was founded to give voice to diverse communities through history. We do this work through a variety of projects and programs, and one of these is the Grand Rapids Time Traveler series that you're joining us for here today. Within this series, we've been moving through the decades, and today I'm delighted that we are gathering to listen to Gangel, our former student staff member and a GVSU alum and current graduate student in Indiana University's Bloomington's Gender Studies Department. G will discuss the flourishing of the local LGBTQ community during the 1960 to 70 time period, especially through tourism and recreational activities. In addition, G's presentation draws on research the Cucci office conducted in partnership with the SaugatuckDouglas History Center with the support of a National Endowment for the Humanities grant. On that note, I wanted to make sure to take this opportunity also to promote the SaugatuckDouglas History Center's upcoming exhibit called A Century of Progress, 100 Years of LGBTQ History. This wonderful exhibit will be held beginning September 4th at 130 Center Street in downtown Douglas and can be viewed from noon to 4 on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays into October. So after G's presentation piques your interest in this topic and you want to explore further, you can head down there or check out the SaugatuckDouglas History Center website to continue learning. One last note before we begin, please use the Q&A feature if you have questions to be addressed during the question portion at the end of the presentation. Please note that we might not be able to get to all audience questions and that this webinar is being recorded and will be available online later this week. So I'd like to thank you once again all for coming today, and I'm going to turn it over to G.
Hello, my name is Gangel. Thank you for joining me today. I also want to thank the Cucci Office of Local History for hosting this and inviting me to speak with you all. I want to start this presentation by recognizing that Saugatuck and Douglas, the twin lakeshore communities that I will be discussing today, reside on the unceded territories of the Potawatomi, Ottawa, and Ojibwa tribes. These communities were forcibly removed from these lands, and I think that it is important to recognize this, especially as we discuss the ways in which this area became known as a home for all. I would also like to take a minute to recognize the language that I will use in this presentation. Although during the time period, the word queer was not widely used as a way to describe the collective LGBT community, I will use the term throughout the presentation for the sake of ease and clarity. Before we begin, I want to give a little bit of insight into my particular background and how I came to research this topic. I graduated from the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program here at Grand Valley in the spring as a McNair Scholar, and I now attend Indiana University, where I'm a PhD student in their Gender Studies program with a minor in history. In my personal research, my primary research concern is monstrosity and our ideas of who and what classifies as monstrous, and why we make determinations that some people are. I also have a special interest in rural studies and have looked at, in specific, how the hillbilly monster has been used to become a weapon of classism and elitism. However, I didn't start my work with Saugatuck until the fall of last year, when I was hired on as a research assistant for the Stories of Summer project. There, I went through hundreds of pieces of ephemera to finish out the metadata so that the project could be fully digitized. I also worked on transcribing several remaining oral histories, as well as created a 3-video guide to using the archive for the collection, which can be found on the Cucci Office YouTube page. During this time, I got the chance to get to know the twin lakeshore communities, and I became very interested in the ways in which these areas were tied to a vibrant queer history of Michigan. Michigan is rightfully so not always seen as the most affirming or accepting places, and in a lot of ways, the state really has limited the ability for queer thriving. That being said, when we look at the state from this lens, we do miss the ways in which the LGBT community overcame these barriers to create a rich history of self-determination. When I was approached earlier this summer with the opportunity to present today, I knew I wanted to look at the factors that facilitated the growth of the area into a queer tourist destination. In this presentation, I'm primarily concerned with the 60s and 70s, although, as a lot of people know with historical research, sometimes things aren't as cut and clear, and I will be using some sources that are outside this time period to think through the ways in which Saugatuck and Douglas has facilitated the growth of the LGBT community in the area. Saugatuck and Douglas are two interconnected communities that are located on the Lake Michigan shoreline, approximately 40 minutes southwest of Grand Rapids. A part of the Bible Belt of Michigan, the area was surprisingly tolerant to difference. Sitting on one of the most beautiful and undeveloped parts of the shoreline, the communities are known across the country as tourist destinations. Tourism provides the town with their primary sources of income. This is because typically under 1,000 members of the community live in the area full-time. It is home to a variety of communities and also became known as a hub for the arts, in part thanks to the Oxbow and Red Barn Theater. Residents from all over the country have historically flocked to this area, both for its beauty and its atmosphere, providing it with a rich history of tourism and community. For the purposes of today's lecture, I'm going to exclusively be looking at queer communities in the area. We are going to start our discussion today with the importance of the blue tempo. However, tales of SaugatuckDouglas must be contextualized within the larger region to understand why it and other queer tourist destinations were so critical in the flourishing of the queer community. For simplicity's sake, we will start our timeline in 1903, when the Michigan legislature passed a law that prohibited gross indecency among men. Although the term was rather loose in definition, this law effectively prohibited the expression of gay male identity. While anti-sodomy laws were already on the books, the passage of the gross indecency law effectively criminalized all same-sex sexual behaviors, even if the behaviors did not include penetrative sex, which had been a requirement for the prosecution of sodomy. By 1939, gross indecency became prohibited for both men and women. Although the previous law did not necessarily apply to lesbian couples, this new act ensured that all homosexual acts, regardless of the gender of the actors, were now illegal. That same year, Michigan passed the criminal sexual psychopath law, which opened the door to psychiatric incarceration related to the convictions of homosexual acts. Michigan was the first state in the Union to enact such a law, which helps to illuminate its homophobic historic tendencies. This law, one of the most openly violent pieces of homophobic legislation, would not be repealed until 1968. You may have noticed that I skipped one event in our timeline, the 1948 enactment of R 436.2 2D. This is because it was this administrative rule that helps to illuminate the importance of the blue tempo in establishing SaugatuckDouglas as a home for all. This administrative rule declared that no licensee, otherwise known as an individual or group with a liquor license, quote, his agent or employee shall permit his licensed premises to be frequented by or become the meeting place, hangout, or rendezvous for known homosexuals. This administrative rule made it effectively illegal to serve alcohol to individuals who were openly homosexual. This law established strict punishments for businesses that failed to comply and effectively limited queer individuals' rights to public space. Bars have historically been a fundamental way for queer individuals to meet and engage with each other, and the passage of this rule eliminated their access to community. Or, at least, it would have if all of the businesses were to comply with it. Luckily enough for SaugatuckDouglas, there was at least one bar that was willing to ignore this rule, the Blue Tempo. The Blue Tempo originated in 1960 as a business plan for what would be known as Toadville, USA. According to the founding petition, the bar was intended to, quote, create a unique atmosphere and structure that would be keeping with the village charm and art theme. To do this, owner Donald Toad Davis intended to create a space where both music and art could thrive. Each of the booths at the restaurant were intended to be themed, and jazz would be a central aspect of the establishment. However, the original petition for the establishment was denied, and instead, Davis revamped his idea into what would be known as the Blue Tempo. The Blue Tempo would go on to be one of the cornerstones of queer tourism in existence in SaugatuckDouglas. This was in major part because the bar was willing to overlook the administrative rule that would prohibit them from becoming a gay bar. Although it was not originally expected to cater predominantly or at all to queer clientele, this willingness to serve alcohol to gay customers necessarily made the Blue Tempo a place where the queer community could flock. As I discussed briefly before, bars were some of the only places that queer individuals could come and meet other queer individuals. At a time where queer bars were supposed to be illegal, this willingness to overlook the law facilitated a healthy queer community. Before long, most of the community understood that the bar was frequented by gay consumers. One woman recounts a story of several family members that went into the bar without this knowledge. They were quite surprised, but it became very well known throughout the community before long. Although there were no advertisements that suggested that the Blue Tempo was a gay bar, word of mouth helped to establish that it was queer-friendly. This word of mouth was then able to spread, and many became acutely aware and acutely familiar with the queerness that was allowed to grow and thrive in the bar. Musicians and patrons of the Blue Tempo played for the locals instead of for gay or straight crowds in particular. They came with the understanding that many gay individuals frequented the bar, but the fact that the queer community was interpolated into the larger local community suggests at least some degree of integration into the dominant social body. This suggests a particular normalization of the queer community in town, which helps to explore why queer people would be drawn to it. Not only were queer folk allowed into these spaces, but they were considered part of the community, something that wasn't common during the time. The patrons of the Blue Tempo were unapologetically forward. Mark Randall, in his account of his interaction with the bar, suggests that he would regularly get catcalled by the men who were in there. This flustered the man, who wasn't yet out at the time that he's speaking about. However, this forwardness goes to show how unapologetic the queer tourists and residents of the area were. In many places, men catcalling each other was a surefire way to come into contact with acts of violence, or at least blatant homophobia. Yet here, patrons were comfortable enough with themselves and the community that they were willing to put themselves in positions that would elsewhere be very dangerous. Even the style of music played at the Blue Tempo facilitated queer immersion into the community. Whether the music was selected intentionally or not, jazz music has a rich history in relation to queer culture and affect. This is because, according to jazz scholars, jazz sits at the intersection of race, class, and sexuality. Its origins are found in groups society deemed unworthy or taboo, which is reflective of the particular subjecthoods faced by many queer people at the time. It also is known as a genre of music that had the potential to experiment and tease out aspects of sexuality that were otherwise silenced in more heteronormative genres. In jazz spaces, sexual fluidity was acceptable, and historically, drag has been an integral part of jazz, whether it was named or not. In this way, jazz was a space where the social norms could be played with. Because of this, it is perhaps symbolic that jazz was the music played at the tempo. Like the genre of music that was played, the blue tempo became a place to tease out issues of gender and sexuality. It was a space that was open to deviance, where strict social rules were not as strict. This fluidity and space to play were defining aspects of queer thriving and acceptance, and acceptance and tolerance were staples at the atmosphere of the bar. Despite the fact that it became known as a gay bar, the blue tempo was given significant space in things like the Commercial Record, a local newspaper. In one instance, as you see on screen, the blue tempo had an entire page-size advertisement. It doesn't necessarily look as big as what you see on screen, but this is just the bottom page of a full news spread. This suggests that the bar was a critical part of SaugatuckDouglas, not simply an afterthought that could be pushed to the margins of the town. The bar didn't have to rely on word of mouth, and it was acceptable enough that entire pages of the local newspaper could be dedicated to it without large amounts of social backlash. This helps to suggest that the blue tempo, and subsequently the queer community, were not hidden away from other aspects of SaugatuckDouglas, like many other queer bars were at the time. Instead, it was a central aspect of the town and had access to public recognition. Unfortunately, the blue tempo would burn down in a 1976 fire, and the town would be left without a gay bar until the opening of the Douglas Dunes in 1982. This did not mean that there were no queer venues, though. Instead, there was a period of time where the primary queer destination was once again North Oval Beach. Oval Beach, a part of the Lake Michigan shoreline, is one of the state's most beautiful stretches of lakeshore. Much of it was a standard beach, but not all of its areas were family-friendly. In fact, there were parts of the beach and the surrounding dunes known explicitly for their relation to gay men. This is because historically, many parts of North Oval Beach in particular have been reserved as a nudist beach. We have evidence that as early as 1897, North Oval Beach was already understood to be a space for gay men. The interim period where there was no formal gay bar, though, would only last 6 years. In 1982, the Douglas Dunes Resort opened. This resort was known explicitly for its queer target audience and was ran by and for gay men. However, despite the area's typically accepting nature, the opening of a gay resort did not come without some controversy. In an interview regarding his time with the Douglas Dunes, original owner Carl Jennings explained that he had significant difficulty with groups that he called, quote, redneck troublemakers, end quote. When he opened the resort, he explores how the business endured property damage and severe threats, including bomb threats for the resort. It was resilient, though, and the Douglas Dunes became a symbol of Lake Michigan queerness. Unlike the Blue Tempo before, the Douglas Dunes was not simply a de facto queer bar. Instead, the resort was created with the explicit intention to cater to queer audiences. It was even advertised as a resort, a queer resort, that was ran by and for gay men. As such, unapologetic sexuality became a cornerstone of the venue. Even their waitstaffs were, quote, hunks, that were hot enough to make a man sweat, according to an article titled Cruising Around. There was no attempt made to water down the messages of queer sexuality at the dunes. Even advertisements were provocative and sexual. Muscle shirts, shirtless men, queer euphemism, and other such markers of queer sexuality were all central in the place that the resort was advertised to the public. As you can see on the right side of the screen, this is one of the images that they used in their advertising. Compared to other places, which may not have had so much focus on the muscles of the back of a man, the Douglas Dunes used these visual markers to establish the queer purposes of the bar. This refusal to water down sexuality was critical in the creation of an affirming society. Neil Atherton notes that the dunes were an incredibly positive space. The overwhelming positive atmosphere where queerness was central and celebrated, Atherton argues, helped to limit queer stigma. The Douglas Dunes was a place to celebrate the lives and realities of gay members of the community, and this positive portrayal of even the campiest aspects of queer life in the area helped to expose residents to the intricacies and beauty of gay life. The two major gay destinations did not only create visibility for gay individuals, though. Instead, they were able to integrate queer culture throughout their businesses. For example, the Dunes was known for events like Mr. Great Lakes contests or even beauty pageants like Miss Gay USA. These events not only gave queer individuals the chance to engage in their own culture, but it also allowed the broader community to see the beauty and the richness of gay culture. This repeated exposure to gay culture helped to ensure that the community was not only queer positive, but that it stayed that way. These major queer venues helped to normalize and destigmatize the communities that frequented them. Raymond Foster, a resident of the area, explains that before the Blue Tempo, he had a very limited idea of the queer community in SaugatuckDouglas, despite being a gay man himself. In this way, the Blue Tempo and the Douglas Dunes became sites of queer exposure. As Nancy Crean suggests in her oral history, this was a period of time where queerness in general was socially unacceptable. These particular venues, then, helped to illuminate a group that was socially silenced, as they gave space for gay culture to become less underground. Once queerness was allowed to enter the public sphere, the larger community became significantly more accepting. This increase in acceptance, then, facilitated the integration of queer culture into the dominant culture of the town, and, as Nancy Crean suggests, it wasn't long before the queer community became a prevalent and important part of SaugatuckDouglas. The general atmosphere of the town also helped to facilitate the growth of the queer community and queer tourism. According to residents, in the 60s and 70s, the presence of the gay community started expanding and more aspects of gay culture entered the public consciousness. This was in part because of the Lakeshore community's openness and tolerance of difference. It was this tolerance of difference that made it safe for queer individuals to be fully authentic and facilitated public displays of queerness. Flamboyant displays of queerness in SaugatuckDouglas did not carry the same risks of retribution that may have existed in other parts of the state or the country. Queer people were able and safe to express themselves in whatever ways they chose in these areas, and that was not something that was universally true. This necessarily allows for the greater integration of the queer community. Residents of SaugatuckDouglas consistently expressed that gay individuals were treated as people, not as gay. This important distinction works to illuminate the openness of the community and their willingness to accept difference. This willingness to accept difference created a space for gay thriving that would not otherwise been as possible. This was because in SaugatuckDouglas, gay individuals were not repeatedly minoritized. Instead, they were viewed as a vital and critical part of the town's heritage and in the preservation of the community. Gay families and gay individuals became an incredibly normalized aspect of the community, something that was untrue in many other queer spaces. Queer people were allowed space to become active, equal members of the community, and that became a key draw to the area. The area also grew to have national recognition, which only increased the visibility and viability of the queer community. Saugatuck and Douglas were not unfamiliar with tourists from Chicago or St. Louis, as both of these areas produced regular summer travels who sought refuge on the Lake Michigan beaches. However, the Blue Tempo and Douglas Dunes became known outside of these regions for their explicitly queer nature. For example, Atlanta-based queer publication Cruise published several articles that explored and heralded the communities for their queer inclusion. This national recognition necessarily increased the appeal of the area for queer individuals across the country. In the 60s and 70s, much of the United States was still overtly homophobic and hostile towards queer communities. The idea that there was a gay paradise in beautiful West Michigan was surprising, and it was enchanting for many of these people. The idea that there was a queer haven where they could be unapologetically themselves brought people from all over the country who were seeking refuge in a place where they could be openly queer without the same fears of violence and homophobia that they might have been used to back home. There were other facilitating factors that allowed for queer thriving in SaugatuckDouglas. One such factor was the predominance of the arts in the area. Known throughout the 1900s as an art colony, Douglas in particular was known for things like the Red Barn Theater and the Oxbow. These art-based communities brought individuals from all across the country to visit. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, gay women and men were among the many groups that were drawn to the thriving arts community in the area. There was also dedicated efforts to ensure that Saugatuck and Douglas remained queer-friendly. Many individuals of the community wanted queer folk to understand that they would be treated as people, not as gay people. This important distinction helps to show that in this area, being gay was fundamentally no different than any other minority identity. This was absolutely critical in the development of the communities into a queer tourist destination. In this time period, the queer identity was not seen as just another identity. It was stigmatized in ways that other identities weren't. So it was absolutely critical to have this willingness to accept people from more than just minority identities. Queer patrons were fully accepted into SaugatuckDouglas in ways that they might not have been in other areas. In the Twin Lakeshore communities, queer folks were able to make statements that not only were they there, but they were proud to be there, which allowed the region to get national recognition for its queer-affirming nature. Surprisingly, several histories of the town also discussed the ways in which the police also helped to facilitate queer inclusion in the town. This was for several reasons. First, it was the police force in the area that elected to ignore the fact that the Blue Tempo was becoming what was known as one of the first, if not the first, gay bar in Michigan. West Michigan, I should say. According to the rule we discussed earlier, this was in flagrant defiance of the law, yet the police of the town chose to overlook this. It's important to note here that we don't know why this decision was made. Obviously, there weren't, in what I was looking at, documents that suggested why the cops overlooked this. But it's important to know that they did. And it was their overlooking it and not criminalizing this bar that helped the community thrive. Neil Atherton also recounts that the police force sometimes acted in solidarity with him and his business, which he ran with his gay partner. In this way, there is some evidence that the police not only didn't work against the community, but there were times that the force actively worked with parts of the community. This is not necessarily unheard of at the time, but it is pretty rare. We're in a time where homosexuality has been criminalized pretty much universally in the United States. And if we look at queer history, we see that in most cases, the police were directly oppositional all of the time. during this period, we're starting to see the rise of things like Stonewall, like active instances of police aggression. So it's interesting to think that these things did not happen in this area. Both scenarios, in which the police simply ignored the queer community and one in which the police actively helped the community, are shocking because the police in general were openly hostile towards these communities. Yet in SaugatuckDouglas, the police did not provide a major obstacle for the queer community organizing, at least not in the same way that it did in other areas. Because the police were not consistently outwardly hostile to gay individuals had greater spaces to be proud, fully authentic members of society, without the same fears of state violence and state silencing that many other queers throughout the country faced at the time. This isn't to say that the police force was completely queer-affirming or even positive, entirely positive in its effect. Like I said, I didn't see evidence of police being queer positive and saying, we looked after these people as a part of our community. In fact, it is quite possible that the opposite was true. Instead of being queer-friendly, it is completely possible that the police simply did not have the resources to heavily police these individuals. After all, several accounts note that there is an inefficiency in the SaugatuckDouglas police. One account that I looked at went so far as to call them, quote, rent-a-cops who had little control over the situations that arose in the town. Regardless, though, the lack of police intervention gave the queer community a chance to integrate into the larger SaugatuckDouglas community without the risk of incarceration or state violence. Although Saugatuck and Douglas became known for their tolerance of queer difference and identity, this tolerance was not universal, nor was it shared by all of its residents. Within the ephemera I had a chance to engage with, there were several instances where the gay community wasn't given a chance, or given space to thrive. Neil Atherton recounts several such circumstances. In one passage of his oral history, he recounts his experiences with an elderly neighbor. He explains that any time there would be cigarette butts lying on the street, she would collect them and place them in the door of his business, which he purports was because he and his business partner were gay. In his testimony, he suggests that he was largely unbothered by it, but this experience does nod to the fact that even though many were tolerant of queer individuals in this community, there was still instances in space for microaggressions. It's important to know this as we think of it as this queer utopia, as this wonderful place, this haven where queer folks can come and be free to express themselves. Although expression was not limited in the same way as in other areas, it wasn't like these areas, these two towns, were completely devoid of homophobia. This is not his only tale of homophobic backlash even. Further in his account, he discusses the backlash he faced in regard to a Venetian festival event. He explains that he suggested the theme for the event be Saugatuck Makes Me Happy, because no matter the person, sexual orientation, gender expression, or other identity, Saugatuck had a way of supporting all of its communities, and he was looking to encapsulate that with his theme. Some members of the Saugatuck community saw a problem with this, though, and he explained that his idea was criticized for being, quote, too gay. This backlash caused him to completely withdraw the idea, as he expresses he didn't want to cause more controversy. These experiences helped to illuminate the ways that Saugatuck and Douglas were not queer utopias. Although the queer community of the area was largely accepted in many ways, this acceptance was imperfect, and no amount of gay positivity can fully circumvent the underlying social homophobia that infiltrated even the most affirming of areas in the time period. Overall, though, Saugatuck and Douglas were spaces of queer thriving where queerness was honored and overwhelmingly accepted. The popularity of the Twin Lakeshore communities as a tourist destination has only grown, and today, the Dunes is heralded as the best queer resort in the Midwest. However, when considering the larger Michigan queer history, many remain completely unfamiliar with the area. This is in part because Michigan queer history is assumed to be centrally located within the southeast parts of the state, namely Ann Arbor and Detroit. Even the University of Michigan, in their elaborate queer history, tends to overlook areas outside of these major metropolises. Despite the timeline's depth, West Michigan is only referenced 4 times. Of those 4 times, Saugatuck and Douglas go unmentioned during the time period, despite the fact that they were absolutely critical in the formation of the gay community on the west side of the state. This overlooking of West Michigan helps to contribute to the idea that queer individuals cannot thrive in traditionally conservative areas. By ignoring the histories of places like Saugatuck and Douglas, we ignore huge swaths of queer populations that we overlook because they are not centralized urban locations. This necessarily obscures the ways in which these areas really did have the ability and potential for large amounts of queer activism and queer thriving. Saugatuck and Douglas became a queer tourist destination despite regional and social constraints of the time period. There were serious hurdles that stood in the way of queer thriving on the Lake Michigan shoreline, yet queer communities in Saugatuck and Douglas were able to overcome these obstacles to contribute to a very rich queer history that is often overlooked. Thank you.
And thank you all for being here for this presentation, and especially G, thank you for sticking with it here despite your illness. I'm sorry about that. And also thank you all for staying with us despite our technical problems. I do believe that we're going to be able to maybe insert those slides into the recording. If those of you who really wanted to see those images later, you might be able to check that out. And I also just want to remind everybody that if you have any questions for our presenter, that you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen there. So I have a question though, and it's the kind of question I like to ask presenters often. As a researcher myself, I'm always interested in a few things. One is, were there things that really surprised you when you were doing your research? And then the second thing is, well, what's a kind of source or aspect of this that you didn't find out and you really wish you could have found?
I think that to answer that second question first, I had gone into this thinking that I would be more looking at people's like personal accounts of going to these areas for tourist reasons, and I found that there wasn't a lot of that existed. I was in my presentation, I focused a lot on the ways in which this area facilitated the queer tourism, but I wasn't able to find as much information about the actual act of tourism that I thought I was going to when I went into it. In terms of, could you repeat the first question? I totally...
That's fine, G. What were there things that surprised you?
Yes. So I think one of the things that surprised me a lot was this like mention of the police that I saw come up again and again, because it was something I wasn't expecting. Obviously, when you are looking at like the Blue Tempo was not supposed to serve alcohol to gay folks. So obviously there's some conversation to be had about like why was that allowed? So it was super interesting to me to see that like the police were in some ways not necessarily allied, but like willing to give queer folks the space, especially in areas like West Michigan, which are notoriously conservative.
Yes, and of course, you generally expect if there's a law that the law will be enforced, and those instances where laws are not enforced are always a rich area for historical research. So that is interesting. One additional question that has come up is, what sort of role do you think, or did you see any role for business economic interests in terms of the reaction of the larger community or the full-time residents of the Saugatuck-Douglas area to what was not just a haven for queer people, but also the Blue Temple, a business that employed people, brought people into the area, et cetera. Did you see anything where, other aspects other than how people felt about other people's sexuality impacted their decision making?
I think especially when you look at like the resorts, so like the Blue Tempo Hotel, the Douglas Dunes, these places, it is important to like note that these places are businesses first. So they are making, like they're producing materials that give all of their race, give all of their information, and they are trying to make it as appealing as possible, because the more appealing you can make these places sound, like the more affirming the Douglas Dunes are, the more likely you're going to get people who are from Florida or from California or other areas that might not have gone there to go there. And I saw some evidence that other businesses in the community also really benefited, whether or not they were outward in their benefit, because this like queer tourism brought huge swaths of people who could spend money, could do all of these things. And I think that in terms of businesses, that is probably part of the reason that it was so accepting, because if you turn these people away, you're turning down money. So like there's the business aspect of, you might like as a person be cool with gay folk, but like the business need to like create money might make you even more tolerant than you might have otherwise been.
Thank you for that. That is of course, these decisions are always multifaceted when we have some sort of example like this from history. One other question that has come up, I think that we'll have to probably end with this one due to time. So is, what other resources would you recommend to look at this topic in particular, or even queer history more broadly?
So if you're interested in particularly queer history in West Michigan, the Saugatuck-Douglas Historical Society and the Coochie office both have worked together for the Stories of Summer project. So they both have super phenomenal resources. But in terms of like more broadly, I often recommend people look at the Gale Archives of Sexuality and Gender if they're interested in these questions, because it has a wide variety of different sources from all over the place. So if there's like one aspect of queer history that you're particularly interested in, it'll be able to direct you to a lot of really good primary sources to answer those questions. So that's the one that I normally, if people are looking more broadly to do this historical research with queer history, like that's a good place to start.
Thank you so much for that, G. And I would also like to thank again everybody who was able to tune in, so to speak, to this presentation. It's been so informative, and I have been very happy to have been able to host this on behalf of the Coochie Office of Local History. Before we close, I do want to make sure that you know that we will be posting this on our YouTube channel shortly, so you can share it with others. And once again, I want to thank all of you for coming, and I want to remind you about the Saugatuck-Douglas History Center's exhibit coming up in downtown Douglas beginning September 4th. This exhibit is called A Century of Progress, 100 Years of LGBTQ History. And it's a great opportunity to learn more about this community that is a part of our diverse past, present, and future. And I, for one, can't wait to visit and learn more about West Michigan summers as we enjoy the last sweet days of this one. With that, I'd like to say thanks again for everybody who attended, and we here at the GVSU Cucci Office of Local History hope to speak with you soon about our West Michigan history. Thanks.